Thank you everyone for coming out tonight on this 100th birthday of Jane Jacobs, and we do have membership forms in the back for those of you that aren't members. Tonight's program is going to allow us to discuss the legacy of Jane Jacobs in the village and beyond, what she was addressing at the time of her involvement and activism sense, and current issues that her legacy might help us address. First we'll hear from each of the panelists, and then I'll help moderate a discussion between them, and then we're certainly going to have time for this smart audience to offer some questions at the end. So please do share at that time. So first I'll introduce each of our panelists, and then I'll invite them to speak one by one. Andrew Berman has been the Executive Director of the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation since 2002. During that time, as you heard, he's helped lead GVSHP in a successful effort to expand landmark protections to more than 1,100 buildings in Greenwich Village, East Village, and NoHo, and to secure contextual zoning protections for nearly 100 blocks of these neighborhoods. Andrew has also helped lead the organization in campaigns to strengthen and preserve local independent businesses, maintain and improve public spaces, and educate the public about the value of preservation and the history of Greenwich Village, East Village, and NoHo, through public programs which reach more than 6,000 real estate professionals, school children, and members of the general public like yourself each year. GVSHP's online resources, including oral histories with preservation pioneers like Jane Jacobs, which I encourage you to check our website to hear her, reach nearly 500,000 users a year. Prior to his tenure with GVSHP, Andrew worked for a member of the State Senate and City Council, representing Lower Manhattan and the West Side, where he focused on issues including land use, preservation, education, housing, and the environment. And in my unbiased opinion, he's the best boss in New York City. Warren Shaw is a writer, historian, professor, and practicing attorney. He has published hundreds of articles and appeared on dozens of television and radio broadcasts discussing New York City's architectural and government history and its role as an incubator of American pop culture. Last year, in partnership with the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, Mr. Shaw curated an exhibit at the Brooklyn Historical Society entitled Gaining Access, the New York City Disability Rights Movement, the first ever museum exhibition about this branch of the American Civil Rights Movement. Mr. Shaw previously hosted a year-long series on National Public Radio about the city's mayoralty. Mr. Shaw is a professor in NYU's Urban Design Studies program, and he is a senior counsel in the Commercial and Real Estate Litigation Division of the New York City Law Department, and we welcome him here tonight. And last but not least, Alice Sparberg Alexiou is the author of the first biography of Jane Jacobs, entitled Jane Jacobs, Urban Visionary, published in 2006, just after she died. Anybody here read that? I encourage you to get it. It's the first one. She's also the author of Flatiron, the New York landmark and the extraordinary city that arose with it, and co-produced a film based on that book for the PBS series Treasures of New York. She's been a contributing editor at the Jewish feminist magazine Lilith, and is a graduate of Columbia University's journalism school, has a PhD in classics, and used to teach Latin. And she was on NPR All Things Considered today, you might have heard her. You can catch it online later. She is a third-generation New Yorker and is currently writing a book about the Bowery to be published in 2008. Let's welcome her. And so our first speaker at the podium will be Andrew Berman.
So it's a little hard to sum up the legacy of Jane Jacobs in 12 minutes, but I'm going to try to do what hopefully is a fair overview in terms of her impact both locally and in terms of the broader preservation movement. A little trouble with the PowerPoint? Oh, there we go. Thank you very much. It's like I was having a little trouble with it. So There's a lot of ways we can look at Jane Jacobs' legacy, both in terms of the specific projects that she had an impact on in Greenwich Village, and then in terms of the larger sort of philosophy of urban planning and community self-determination. I'd like to look at just sort of some of the highlights of the projects that she had an impact on. The first one is, of course, the Lower Manhattan Expressway. Jane is largely credited with leading the fight to stop the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which is one of the first defeats that Robert Moses faced. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, the Lower Manhattan Expressway would have cut through Lower Manhattan and destroyed a big chunk of neighborhoods like Soho, which was called Soho at the time, Little Italy, the southern part of Greenwich Village. It really would have made this lower part of Manhattan a highway throughway, not dissimilar to what Moses had done with the southern part of the Bronx and the Cross Bronx Expressway. And I think she and others were very conscious of the incredibly negative impact that sort of project had, and it was certainly a very high priority for her to stop it, and of course, as we know, it did not get built. Here's another image showing what some of that plan looked like. It was not only to build a highway, but the thinking was that there would be quite a few high-rise towers built along the way, just added in for good measure. Another project which Jane was very much involved with stopping, which was connected to this, was the plan for extending Fifth Avenue through Washington Square Park and basically turning it into an on-ramp or an extension of the Lower Manhattan Expressway. So what you can see here in the image on the left is what the park had looked like. On the right, this is what it would have looked like under the plan. This is a draft of what it would have looked like. You would have had this sort of vehicular underpass going through the entire park. All of this traffic would have been channeled from Midtown Manhattan into Lower Manhattan, going through Washington Square. As you can imagine, this would have dramatically transformed the character of the park. Now, the park in the 1950s did in fact have traffic going through it, not quite like this. It was not superhighway traffic. What's now the open area around the fountain did allow cars to go through and buses to turn around. That was, of course, ended in the late 1950s, but this would have been a step far beyond that. So fortunately, not only was it stopped, but it was in fact, even what had been there before was eventually eliminated. Another area in which Jane was very active was the push for landmark protections for Greenwich Village. And though it was not until 1965 that the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission was constituted such that it could actually designate landmarks and historic districts in New York, she was actively pushing for this for the entirety of Greenwich Village in the years before the Landmarks Preservation Commission got its powers. The designation of the landmark of the Greenwich Village Historic District was in 1969, at which point Jane had actually already moved to Toronto the year before, but nevertheless she was one of the most vocal advocates for including as much of the neighborhood as possible. What you see on the left here was the original proposal from New York City for a series of small landmark islands in Greenwich Village, leaving a lot of space open for demolition and new development. What you see there on the lower right is what was eventually designated in terms of the Greenwich Village Historic District. Now, Jane had actually pushed for basically the entirety of Greenwich Village to be designated, and I want to read to you from a letter that she sent to the chair of the commission in October of 1963, not only because it tells you what she was specifically pushing for here, but gives you a sense of how she viewed neighborhoods and cities and their importance. And so this is to Mr. James Vanderpool, chairman of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. From Jane Jacobs. We understand that the Commission will shortly consider the attributes of Greenwich Village as a historic area, and that there may be some question as to where the western boundary of the area is drawn. This concerns us both as West Villagers and as citizens of New York who take considerable pride and interest in Greenwich Village as a whole. We urge that the proposed historic area include all of western Greenwich Village. That is, the western boundary be drawn not short of West Street. There are a number of cogent reasons for including, most particularly, the westernmost blocks. As you know, the West Village was the old river landing settlement. From its beginnings, this settlement combined work, residence, and transportation, and these activities, while local, were not provincial. They all had ties, in part, to the larger settlement of New York. With truly remarkable integrity and fidelity, this historic land use persists today. Work, residence, and transportation with very similar links and the same quality of being local but unprovincial. This really spoke to the way she saw communities succeeding with a mixture of uses, and in fact here is a copy of that memo transcribed. And in the years since then, while the original Greenwich Village Historic District did stop short of where she wanted it to go, we and others have worked very hard to try to ultimately fulfill that vision. I see Zach is here from the Greenwich Village Community Task Force, who certainly worked very hard on that, along with GVSHP and lots of other folks. 2003, the Gansevoort Market Historic District here. 2006, the extension of the Greenwich Village Historic District and the designation of the Weehawken Historic District, the Westbeth designation in 2011, and some individual landmark designations here. In fact, interestingly, in Jane's letter to the Commission, she cited about 6 or 8 specific buildings in this far western section of Greenwich Village that were exemplars of why this area deserved to be landmarked, none of which were included in the Greenwich Village Historic District, all but one of which have since been landmarked. This is 9 Weehawken Street, 177 Street, 6 Weehawken Street, 398 West Street, 159 Charles Street. This is the old Sailors Hotel on the corner of 10th and Charles. This is the former Shepherd Warehouse. This is what also was at one point, according to her letter, a Sailors Hotel on the corner of 10th and Weehawken, and this is the tenement at 391 West Street. So she specifically cited these as examples of why this area should be landmarked, not at the time, but in the intervening years since then they have been, which is really wonderful and not an accident, certainly the result of a lot of hard work. So another project that Jane was key in preventing from happening was Robert Moses's plan for an urban renewal project for the area of Greenwich Village west of Hudson Street, exactly the area that she was trying to get landmarked. So if you see this red line over here, that shows the area that Moses had designated as blighted and therefore to be subject to urban renewal. It's between Hudson Street and West Street, several blocks which probably would have been in large part replaced with towers in the park like this. Fortunately, that did not happen. In fact, what did happen was that many years later, a lot of the sites that were to be developed were developed with the West Village houses, which were an attempt to, though Jane had long since left the neighborhood, although very much remained connected to and in dialogue with folks here, were an attempt to try to apply the principles of what she and others believed in, which is that you didn't want to necessarily have high-rise towers with lots of open space around them. You wanted low scale, you wanted an ability for people to interact. There are lots of communal spaces. This is an aerial view of one of the blocks of West Village houses, so you can see how they have these open spaces around them. So it's really much more similar to the traditional built form in New York. Now, by the time this was built in the mid-1970s, the fiscal crisis had hit. There was much less money for it than originally planned. A lot of the details in terms of design and things like that were not done in exactly the way they were originally planned. But nevertheless, the planning principles of this kind of infill housing, as opposed to wiping the slate clean and starting over with something that looks nothing like what's around it, was applied here at a larger scale for one of the first times. And that really was a pretty dramatic change on her part. So looking more broadly in terms of the philosophical impact she had, much of that came from her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which was published in 1961. This is, I would say, a brief summary of what are some of the principles that she espoused that have had such an impact on our city and in general on urban planning since then. One is that average citizens, not just urban planners, should have a say in the future of their communities. Another was that old buildings were not necessarily blight, but could be reused and adapted. Another was that large highways and enormous planned developments could kill neighborhoods, and she'd seen that happen. And places where people gathered and visible symbols of community and culture were extremely important to neighborhoods. They were touchstones. They were part of the reason why people lived there. She certainly helped spur forward the nascent landmark preservation movement in New York City, and while she was not successful at Penn Station, as I mentioned before, just a few years later, the Landmarks Preservation Commission was given the power to designate and did start to do that in neighborhoods across the city. The approach that she espoused was clearly a part of what led to successes with things like the old Jefferson Market Courthouse, now the Jefferson Market Library. I mean, there's really few buildings that are a better example of a cultural touchstone, of a site that had meaning to a community, that was a symbol of the community, and instead of going the route that would have been done in the past, as was proposed, of simply demolishing it, new life was breathed into it as a library that plays such a vital role in the community. Here as well, similarly, in this time period, the 1960s, the former Astor Library and Heber Aid Society, again, proposed for demolition, new life breathed into it as the public theater. Of course, now it's such an incredibly contributing piece of not just the local fabric, but citywide. And here again, this was an approach that Jane Jacobs, I think, took from being almost never considered to being really the first way we think of going when an old historic building like this becomes endangered. Similarly, by 1970, the old Bell Telephone Labs were turned into West Beth Artist Housing, which not only for many years has provided affordable housing for many, many people in the arts, but really helped transform this part of Greenwich Village. The battles that Jane fought and the pushback against top-down planning led to some structural changes in terms of the way things were done in New York. One, of course, was the establishment of community boards, which are a big part of the planning process in New York now. Manhattan was the first borough to start to have community planning boards, and then they were instituted citywide. They are now the main vehicle through which any sort of planning decision in New York City is vetted at the local community level. And as imperfect as they are, there was nothing like this beforehand. And they do provide a vehicle for any member of the public to come out, be heard, for there to be an official record of what the community thinks about something, and then the decision makers can follow it or not follow it at their peril. This was, as I said, instituted in the 1960s, and then not long after that, we instituted in New York the Uniform Land Use Review procedure, which here again integrated into the planning process a structure that required a level of community consultation and input. Again, as imperfect as it is, prior to this, the process was nothing like that. Folks like Robert Moses could basically say, I'm going to tear this down, I'm going to build this is going to go, this is going to come. So this really was a very dramatic shift in terms of the way that things were done here in New York. And because Jane was such an advocate for a mixture of uses, and I don't think we can emphasize enough how much at the time the thinking was that it was bad to have people living near businesses or entertainment or other types of uses, that we needed to kind of start over in this rational way where people lived in one location, they shopped in another location, they worked in another location. She really felt that having all of these uses mixed together was what made cities and neighborhoods so vital. And Greenwich Village was a perfect example of that, as her memo spoke to, that you did have these places of work and commerce next to where people lived. And so, you know, when Soho, which was a manufacturing district, people started to move in there, this was reflective of the notion that there was, at least on the part of some, going against the prevailing tide, there was not a fear of living around business or commerce. That not only was that okay, but that it could in fact be enriching. So she really had a big impact in that regard as well, and you see that in places like Tribeca as well. Finally, I just want to say that certainly from our end, Jane has spurred us onward to continue with the push for expanded landmark designation for our neighborhood. As I said, she was a big advocate for that, and as was mentioned in the opening remarks, in the time since that first wave of successes in the 1960s that she was so involved with, there has been an addition of more than 1,100 landmark buildings in Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo, helping to fulfill more and more, if not all, of the vision that she originally had of a well-preserved historic neighborhood. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to commemorate the centennial of Greenwich Village's true patron saint. You're going to hear a lot of laudatory and admiring thoughts tonight, and I certainly don't want to disagree. I have great respect for Jane Jacobs' insights and the changes that they've wrought in the way our cities function over the past 50 years. But for a moment, I'd like to focus on the unanticipated costs of the Jacobs Revolution. Actually, it was a counter-revolution, part of the profound historical sweep that underlies both urban renewal and the reaction against it. New Yorkers and urban historians are sort of used to describing this in a sort of shorthand as Robert Moses versus Jane Jacobs, but it really is a lot more than that. The origins of urban renewal reach back to the very roots of modernity, back to the Industrial Revolution, and to a tradition of utopian dreams of the ideal city which emerged in the 19th century in the depths of nightmarish industrial cities, polluted, crowded, chaotic, the cities of Dickens and Marx and Engels. And the critical point of this origin is this: because the industrial city had emerged without any deliberate intention, because the industrial urban fabric was chaotic and environmentally degraded, all of these utopian ideas from the Garden City to the Radiant City shared some common assumptions, namely orderly central planning, lots of open space and hygienic ventilation, and built from scratch designs. So as a result, urban renewal, which was the offshoot of this tradition, took as its starting point, as a principle, that the industrial city was flawed beyond salvage. It could not be reformed, it had to be remade. Meanwhile, in the real world, incremental reforms to the industrial city did come about in the late 19th and early 20th century through regulation of private industry and public investment in modern infrastructure. And New York City emerged as a world leader in this effort with waves of tenement reform, massive public investment, professional fire, health, and buildings departments, prohibition of child labor, maximum work hours, scientific fire and structural safety codes, and zoning, and so forth. And it worked. It really did. Without rebuilding from scratch, without abandoning traditional ways of living, including the block-by-block mixture of residence and work that cities had known since their medieval origins, the New York City of the 1920s was vastly, radically improved from the dark and dangerous days of, say, the 1860s. But here's the problem. No one emerged to identify or celebrate the accomplishments of the reformed industrial city. In fact, there's a book on this subject by John Tiefert that bears the strikingly apt title of The Unheralded Triumph. The problem was that the reforms to the industrial city happened slowly enough that they became taken for granted over generations. And they failed to counter what was already the established pull of the Garden City and the Radiant City. So that when the Depression came and Keynesian economics put government front and center in rebuilding the shattered economy, it naturally turned to the clear-cutting Radiant City ideas, and projects like Williamsburg houses and Red Hook houses became national models for urban renewal. And this, is where Robert Moses comes in as a gifted executor of apparently settled ideas. The man who could get things done. I mean, he tends to get the blame for the fact that Le Corbusier's theory of urbanism turned out to be wrong, but you know, I don't know that that's fair. He didn't originate the theory, he wasn't a theoretician, he just proved its defects through example. Anyway, next, in the post-war flush of prosperity and American self-confidence, urban renewal derived a lot of its support from the faith in the future that we know as modernism. For those of you who remember, and I can see that some of you do, modernism was a powerful synergism of philosophy and aesthetics, a transformative, integrated vision of the future. It brought together sociological and economic and governmental and artistic ideas, and it existed a profound and pervasive influence during the years of the New Deal consensus, especially after World War II. And it's important to remember just how far these ideas penetrated into the mainstream. Corbusier's idea of the radiant city concept of high-rise towers set amid landscaping and roadways became the iconic image of modernism. It was visible everywhere, from the 1939 World's Fair to Rockefeller Center to the Emerald City to the Jetsons' supercar Fireball XL5. You remember those shows, don't you? So, even though urban renewal's public housing was far removed from the wealth and glamour of, let's say, Lever House, they shared a similar Brave New World impact and a similar aesthetic vocabulary, so that urban renewal benefited from the reflected power of modernism, and on the other hand, modernism became tied to the success of urban renewal. But as urban renewal projects rolled out in increasing volume, it became clear that the radiant city, which looked enlightened, humane, and civilized on paper, was something very different in the real world. The radiant city began as a noble utopian idea. We tend to forget that too, because in practice, it was callous, authoritarian, and largely indifferent to the displacement that it caused. And it turned out that radiant city urbanism spread the great blight of dullness far more effectively than it promoted happiness or human interaction. And when urban renewal, led by Robert Moses, reached out to Washington Square Park and the West Village, it began to reap the whirlwind in the person principally of Jane Jacobs, whose originality and take-no-prisoners prose pulled the lid off of America's then ingrained habit of deferring to authority. With Jane Jacobs, the actual urbanism of the reformed industrial city finally came to the fore. She opened our eyes to what was right in front of us, part of her biting, effective critique of top-down planning and the radiant city. And all that's wonderful. I don't mean to take anything away from that, but here's where the ideas of Jane Jacobs and her colleagues have taken a toll. Their challenge to top-down authority easily bled into a dismissal of authority in general, especially in the 1960s. And this morphed under resurgent conservatives into an ideological opposition to all government regulation. To put in poetic terms, Bob Dylan's "Don't Follow Leaders" turned into Ronald Reagan's "Government isn't the solution, government is the problem." Second, the challenge to modernism through the tie to urban renewal easily segued into a rejection of modernism, into a rejection of its faith in the future, into nostalgia, into a belief that the past was better than the present. So that in overthrowing the Tower in the Park movement and its chief advocate in New York City, Robert Moses, along with them, they took down modernism itself, so that by the early 1970s, the transformative force of modernism had been destroyed. And under this new perspective, it followed that new was likely to be worse, not better. a very unsettling idea in America. Reinforced right afterwards by Watergate, the oil shock, stagflation, followed by the offshoring of our economic base, America developed a real identity crisis. We sometimes call it the culture wars. The consensus in favor of FDR's New Deal and LBJ's Great Society shredded. Support for the social safety net, investment in infrastructure, and sensible regulation of the private market fell victim to a national conversation that's increasingly bitter and nasty, and yet largely free of actual constructive ideas. And, you know, if you read the papers today, you know how true this still is. We are still living in this sense in the post-Jacobs moment, the post-fall of modernism moment. Arthur C. Clarke, the great science fiction writer and the author of 2001, A Space Odyssey, forgive me, I'm thinking of another departed great American, Bowie, New Yorker too. Anyway, Arthur C. Clarke once said, one thing I wouldn't have predicted about the 20th century was that we'd go to the moon and then stop. Well, for me, that is an apt metaphor for the United States. We've lost modernism's vision of the future, and nothing of remotely comparable scope and grandeur has taken its place. In our national imagination, the future has largely evaporated. That's why flashes of radiant city images still show up sort of zombie-like in futuristic films like the Star Wars series. We may no longer believe in modernism, but we have no other imagery to turn to when it comes to the future. And you know, believe me, I am no fan of radiant city urbanism, but this is a high price to pay for killing off the tower and the park, and it's a price that no one anticipated. So, in conclusion, Jane Jacobs made us see and value the benefits and the beauties of the reformed industrial city. Hers was a protective mission, not a destructive one. But in attacking the tower and the park, in attacking the authoritarian excesses of a Robert Moses, her insights unintentionally helped to drive us into the cul-de-sac of futurelessness, live for today, and nostalgia that we're now stuck in. And you know, I can't help but wonder what might have happened. I mean, to me, Jane Jacobs was late. And what might have happened if she had shown up to celebrate the reformed industrial city 40 years earlier in the 1920s, before it became necessary to destroy modernism? Maybe we could have had both. I don't know. Anyway, thank you very much.
You hear me? Can you hear me, everybody? Not too loud? Andrew talked about Jane Jacobs' activism in Greenwich Village. I'm going to talk about Jane Jacobs as a writer. Her 1961 book, this is my well-used copy, really rocked our world. You know, it changed forever how we see cities. And this is a given. I don't think anybody disputes this. But the question that I'm throwing out here is, how did she do this? You know, I mean, this was a huge, as Donald Trump would say, on everyone's mind. It was really an unbelievable accomplishment. Jane wrote Death and Life during the post-war exodus to the suburbs. Cities were getting a really bad rap. People hated cities, or at least they believed that they hated cities. That was kind of the zeitgeist. White people were fleeing the cities, And the people who couldn't afford to leave were increasingly people of color. And we white folks, growing up in the 50s and the 60s, were told that the cities were dirty and dangerous, in contrast to the clean new suburbs. At least that was the message I got growing up in Great Neck, New York. Third generation New Yorker. It was very interesting because, you know, my grandparents came from that whole urban ghetto background that probably you all came from as well, but just totally rejected the city, you know, and that was kind of the, you know, the accepted point of view at that time. So, you know, to touch on what the two speakers before me talked about, the solution to this, quote, problem of the cities was thought to be large-scale urban renewal. Whole neighborhoods were knocked down in their place, high-rise projects arose, which quickly deteriorated. So then along comes Jane Jacobs, this woman who had no training as a city planner. She actually started out life as a journalist, which is a very good way to, not just because it teaches you to write on a deadline, but being a journalist teaches you just to look, you know, just to observe, just to listen, and not to bring dogma with you, just to tell the story. Well, that's what Jacobs did. You know, she looked around her and she said, realized that this large-scale urban renewal just didn't work. She taught us how people use space. She taught us that high density in a city neighborhood is a good thing, which was the opposite of what people believed in those days. People were always talking about the crowded city and how unhealthy it was and how you had to move out to the suburbs and breathe the fresh air. Jacobs taught us that we must preserve old buildings, not just because they're beautiful and they anchor us in time and give us a sense of security, but they also they nurture artists and they nurture small businesses. She taught us that urban dwellers need public space, but also that it must be designed to fit the needs of the people who use it, not just the fantasies of planners and bureaucrats. She taught us that a community has the right to participate in planning decisions affecting it. She argues against restrictive zoning. She encourages mixing the residential and the commercial. All these ideas were anathema 50 years ago. Today, mixed use is cool. Most of all, Jacobs taught us to love cities. These are all ideas that we take for granted now. How did she pull this off? It was largely on account of her genius and her talents as a writer, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I also want to emphasize that she came along at a very propitious time. She was practicing her activism and finding her voice as a writer and activist in the beginning of the 60s, which was such a fertile time. This was when everything was happening: civil rights movement, gay rights, women's rights, the anti-war movement. Lenny Bruce was being tried for obscenity. The world was being turned upside down, and Jacobs was part of that wave. She was not specifically feminist, although it is worth noting that her book, along with Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, and Rachel Carson's book, The Silent Spring, were all published within a year of each other. She also concurrently with Jacobs and these other two women, was Thomas Kuhn's book, The Nature of Scientific Revolutions, which popularized the idea of paradigm change. Jacobs' ideas about cities caused a paradigm change. And the reason she was able to effect that was because of the time and also because of her genius as a writer. She was not, by any means, the only person noticing what a miserable failure high-rise projects were turning out to be. Everybody was talking about it. But Jacobs was the one who articulated it. She achieved this change through her eloquence. She described her ideas in this absolutely exquisite language. Today, Death and Life is part of the American canon. It's a classic just as much as Homer or Virgil or Sappho or Ovid or Dante or Shakespeare, Milton, the Bronte sisters, Jane Austen, Henry James, Edith Wharton, Walt Whitman, Langston Hughes, James Baldwin. Death and Life is part of the American canon. It's required reading in architecture and planning departments. In a world that is now connected through tweets and text messages, nobody, absolutely nobody writes prose today like Jane Jacobs. I have a lot of favorite Jane Jacobs quotes. My absolute favorite is, "Suburbs are inherently parasitic because they live off the answers of cities," which means a lot of things. But I also I'm going to ask you to just indulge me, and I'd like to read for you that famous passage. Not the whole passage, but just the first paragraph of the Sidewalk Ballet. Under the seeming disorder of the old city, wherever the old city is working successfully, is a marvelous order for maintaining the safety of the streets and the freedom of the city. It is a complex order. Its essence is intricacy of sidewalk use, bringing with it a constant succession of eyes. This order is all composed of movement and change, and although it is life, not art, we may fancifully call it the art form of the city, and liken it to the dance, not to a simple-minded precision dance with everyone kicking up at the same time, twirling in unison and bowing off en masse, but to an intricate ballet in which the individual dancers and ensembles all have their distinctive parts which miraculously reinforce each other and compose an orderly whole. Jacobs deconstructed cities. In fact, later in life, she became very interested in chaos theory. She teaches us how to look at cities. She tells us to look around and judge for ourselves. She tells us not to muddle our brains with academic literature and boring treatises that planners write about cities. She tells us to just watch and take it all in and think. Trust your own eyes, she always said. There are so many complicated ideas in this book, and you can reread it over and over again, and you will keep finding more and more ideas each time. Her ideas can be spun in any direction. Just as clergy people quote scripture to justify their positions on delicate subjects, planners cite Jane Jacobs to justify whatever position they take, urban-wise. For example, Bloomberg's city planning commissioner, Amanda Burton, always said that Jane Jacobs informed every decision she ever made. Well, you know, Amanda Burton pushed hard for every mega project in the Bloomberg administration. So what, in God's name was she talking about? Well, here's another, dirty little secret. All these people who invoke her name, I don't think most of them ever read her. Jane Jacobs has become kind of a folk hero Today we have Jane Jacobs Walks every year. We have a Jane Jacobs Award given by the Rockefeller Institute. We have an opera in the works about Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses. Today she was even Google's logo. I don't know if any of you noticed it, but in honor of her birthday. But we really have to be careful not to reduce her to a caricature. Her legacy is so much more complicated than that, which leads me to the last question that I want to throw out to you. Do her ideas, the ideas that she set forth in 1961, still apply in the 21st century? I think that they do. For example, do you remember during the Bloomberg administration, there was a proposal to rezone Midtown, and the rationale was that too many of the office buildings are old, and that we need more modern skyscrapers in Midtown if we want to stay competitive with the rest of the world. For example, China and India and all these cities that are, building up to the sky. Well, that proposal was shot down very, very quickly. Preservation people apparently put a lot of pressure on Bloomberg administration not to go ahead with this. And I think, we have to thank Jane Jacobs for ensuring that outcome. The idea of destroying the New York skyline was just unacceptable. Jacobs was, as Warren talked about before, her activism in the around 1965 helped bring about the landmarks law. So now we're very, very conscious of the value of New York landmarks. There are a lot of architectural critics, planners, what have you, who argue that we are really post-Jane Jacobs in the 21st century. They feel that her ideas are past their time, that the world has changed so much since 1961, and of course it has, but I don't agree that we're post-Jane Jacobs. I think that her ideas will always apply. You just have to be really careful about how you apply them. You have to apply them contextually and case by case. When you think about the problems of cities today as compared to 1961, we love to preserve our old buildings, but these days only the rich can afford to do this. And this falls under that rubric of the law of unintended circumstances. Jacobs really pushed for gentrification, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of problems with gentrification. The Bloomberg administration rezoned areas all over town since 2002. And of course, Jacobs was a big proponent of mixed zoning. But on the other hand, the result is that you get all this upzoning, which has, is problematic. It's ruined a lot of blocks. So again, you can't just take Jane Jacobs' ideas and use it as a canon. It's more of a sort of contextual guide to anybody who is thinking about or working in cities. I want to say one last thing about Jane Jacobs' legacy. There was a glaring omission in her work, and that was that she did not deal with race. But she did not prescribe solutions to urban problems. She she described them. And she described cities in such beautiful clarity. And being a critic is a time-honored profession as long as you've earned it. And she certainly earned it. Nobody else has described cities as she did in 1961. And this is why we should keep reading her. Thank you.
Thank you, each of you. That was awesome. A nice little spectrum and overview with the visuals to, as an activist and advocate, to a writer and thinker. And I just do have a few questions, and we're certainly going to leave a lot of time, so please, those of you that have them, think of your questions so we can frame it succinctly for everyone. What I'm interested to hear from each of you, perhaps, is, you know, we're all Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs was one person, and we all somehow are care today to come out. So what I'd like to hear each of you think about is, and Alice, you talked about this age of Twitter, so maybe you can start. You know, how do ideas gain currency? How does it go viral? How, through what networks are we still reading her, and why is that important?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just, people still read her, you know, college curriculums include death and life. Not just in city planning courses. I mean, I've heard of her being included in humanities syllabi. I'm not sure I really understand your question. What?
Of many authors, of
Yeah.
many ideas, of many concepts that might be good or bad. She wrote a book, but
Right.
people read it, some people promoted it, maybe there were campaigns that were successful that led more people to become interested in it.
You mean at the time?
In general, however you want to interpret that. She wrote a book and we're still reading it and learning from it today. How did that happen?
Oh, how did that happen? Oh, that's an easy question. It happened because she was such a brilliant writer. You know, people are still going to opera. People are still reading Virgil. People are still reading, you know, the Bronte sisters. And, you know, in some ways that's pretty incredible, isn't it? In the age of 140 characters and an attention span of 2 seconds. And, you know, most of us are old enough to remember a time when we couldn't look things up immediately and the world was much slower. And yet, there is still an audience for wonderful prose and wonderful music and wonderful poetry. And I think that there always will be. There may be less of an audience, but nevertheless, there will be an audience. And it's simply the power of her words. You know, I mean, I could sit here and start reading this book out loud to you, but you know, you can do that for yourself. How many of you have read this, by the way? So, you know, does is what I'm saying resonating with you about this book, that what a punch it packs, how beautifully it's written, how it expresses such original thoughts in such an original way, and there's not one cliche in this book. I mean, I'm a writer, for God's sakes, you know. I mean, every sentence I write, you know, I have to erase because there's a cliche. You know, I mean, this woman was just a genius, just an absolute, what do you call it, a wordsmith.
I think she was a great writer. I also think because she wrote about the way people live their lives, that was particularly resonant to people. I also, you know, I'm disadvantaged in that this book was published before I was born, so I can't say that I was there to feel the impact that it had, but my sense is also she was finally saying, and I think you referenced this, something that people had been feeling and noticing, and that there was a disaffection about, but nobody had really kind of put So I think it really kind of opened a floodgate and sort of tapped a kind of cultural need that was there but hadn't really been expressed or channeled before that. And I think that's part of the reason why it's such a huge impact and why it continues to have an impact even today.
There was also a great currency in the prose, which is a little hard to recapture 50 years later, but in those days, the walls between authoritative and academic culture and popular culture were still pretty well standing. And one of the things that Jacobs did was to express complex ideas that were academic in their origins, but to do it in a way that was utterly free of jargon, except the jargon that she devised, which was really very straightforward, phrases like eyes on the street. I'm too young to have to remember when Jacobs' book came out, but I certainly remember the effect that she had on Washington Square Park, because we used to go, my family used to go down there a lot when I was way too young to even say Washington Square Park. My sister and I called it the park without cars instead. And boy, we got that. But I do remember the first time I read the book. I was in my mid-20s, and I was so blown away by it that I read chunks of it to my wife, and to this day, to my classes here at Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, read passages. Particularly, my favorite one is the one that ends up with, as if the goal of cities and city planning was that Christopher Robin should go hoppity hoppity on the grass. Now that was mind-blowing in those days, and it's still very fresh today. So when you marry the freshness of her ideas and the closeness of her observations with the freshness of her prose, you have something that is really going to be deathless.
You talked about race, Alice, and for me, my work in the South Bronx, I've seen the negative impacts of highway development on communities, not only on the immediate pollution of asthma, but the destruction of the entire fabric of the neighborhood. So, and Andrew, you pointed it in one of the slides, the vision of the Lower Manhattan Expressway. Could you touch upon, each of you, or one of you, or all of you, how, there were some successes against Robert Moses in Greenwich Village and surrounds, and not the same success in the South Bronx? And are there reasons for that are relevant today?
I can speak to that briefly on a somewhat personal
Mike,
level.
please.
We'll give it a shot. I think with the mic it might be a little too much.
Don't hold it too close.
Can you hear? Okay, how's this? This work? All right. So I was actually speaking to somebody about this earlier today. My family was actually displaced by the Cross Bronx Expressway. Its construction in the 1950s, and even in Greenwich Village, Robert Moses succeeded. Washington Square Village and Silver Towers, those urban renewal developments, those were the product of Robert Moses. Clearly one of the advantages that Jane Jacobs and Greenwich Village had was it was a relatively well-organized, relatively well-educated, relatively empowered community. At the time it was not quite the same as resourced of a community as it is now, but clearly folks there were probably in a position to be able to access the levers that existed, such as they were, in a way that maybe some folks elsewhere weren't able to. But I think that the fact that she was able to sort of turn that tide back for the first time had beneficial effects throughout New York City and provided a model. A lot of the groups that in the years since then have been so successful in places like the Bronx, Nostradamus, and a lot of other groups, I think really build upon a model that Jane and many other people helped pioneer, which was for community self-determination. And in a lot of ways, I think ultimately that's one of the core lessons to take from Jane Jacobs, that a lot of it was about that there should be a level of community self-determination, which at that point was, almost not even considered by the powers that be. It was almost entirely top-down.
Do you want to touch on that?
It's interesting that chapter in my book to the South Bronx because it tied in so. Can you hear me? No. I devote a whole chapter in my book to the South Bronx in the context of Jane Jacobs and activism and how did her lesson, how was it applied 40 years later in Melrose. And, so I went up there and spent a couple of days and I was just blown away by the kind of organizing that had been accomplished, the kind of housing that had been built, this great, scale, what do they call it, low scale, or, not high rise, it's the opposite of high rise. And also it was a coalition of public and private money. So I kind of don't agree with the premise of your question. The premise being, why was it successful in the Village but not in the Bronx? But 40 years later, I mean, you would know this better than I because this is, your domain. But my understanding was that the Bronx had made quite a remarkable recovery using some very Jacobean principles. Can you do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, well, the Melrose Commons was a wonderful success story of creating affordable housing, preserving community gardens, and forcing an administration to go back to the drawing board about an initial plan. Nonetheless, the Triborough Bridge and the ring of highways were created, and the Cross Bronx Expressway was built. But you're right, because the successes are being built upon that you pointed out from the enriching organizing in the Bronx. You might have read recently that Cuomo actually is allocating $97 million to remove the Sheridan Expressway in the Bronx, a project of Moses that actually was thwarted from its larger scope to cut through the Bronx Zoo. So we're still financially paying for the costs of Mr. Moses today. Or you seem to have something that Ed.
Yeah, I think we can bring both halves of this question together in this way. The two neighborhoods that were initially successful in opposing urban renewal were Brooklyn Heights and Greenwich Village. And what those two neighborhoods had in common in the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s was that they became popular with what the author of the book, Invention of Brownstone Brooklyn, whose name I forget at the moment, refers to as the new class, the new middle class. What Robert Reich refers to as symbol analysts, writers, editors, journalists, as opposed to the older middle class, primarily people who worked with their hands and engaged in union labor. And there was a lot of distinction here. I mean, in some respects, the opposition that was successful in Brooklyn Heights and Greenwich Village was opposed to the New Deal consensus. Remember, that urban renewal flowed out of the New Deal. It was part of liberalism. We tend to forget this now. And the thrust against it led in some not terribly direct, but not terribly indirect way into individualism, into identity politics, in some curious way, the growth of the mythology of a neighborhood, which was heavily promoted both in Greenwich Village and in Brooklyn Heights, coincided with the hollowing out of neighborhood society. Sociologists who studied habits of social interactions among Americans in the past 50 years have noted the following. We spend probably more time with our nuclear family than we did 50 years ago. We spend as much time as we did 50 years ago with people who agree with us on abstract issues. People we spend less time with are people who we happen to share a neighborhood with. That's why bars are emptier. That's why it's so hard to galvanize political action on a neighborhood basis, even though we're talking about one of the most successful neighborhood agitators. Nonetheless, one of the more profound changes in American society since then has been the falling away of that sort of activism. So there's a lot of paradoxes here. And the fact that the Bronx 40 years later has learned the model of local self-organization is a wonderful thing. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't a generation later and that there weren't some heavy losses in between.
Some comments or questions from the audience, please? Yes.
So the last couple of years in the urbanist press or autocracy, there's been a lot of talk about high prices in cities caused by a lack of new supply coming online. You have like The Rents is Too Damn High by Matt Iglesias, The Gated City by Ryan McDaniels, Triumph of the City by Ed Laser at Barber. Given that I assume the people on the stage tend to support preservation of mid-rise buildings over new taller buildings that might house more people, what are your thoughts on supply side increases in housing that might moderate price increases?
You know, the problem with economic models is that they are developed and considered in the abstract as if all else is equal, but all else is not equal. And what distorts the market in New York City isn't simply rent control, which might have the effect of constraining supply towards the bottom. What also works the functioning of the market in New York is its international perception that it's a safe place to park your dough. And so that the super rich around the world are investing in the United States by buying real estate in New York. And that has a very distorting effect on the market here because it means there's almost an infinite supply of money, and therefore prices can go up without limit because market elasticity is infinite, or something very close to that as compared to most other parts of the United States.
There might be a few tens of thousands of units that have been bought by international buyers looking to invest money. New York has something like 2 or 3 or 4 million apartments. I mean, that might have an effect in certain neighborhoods in Midtown or the Upper East Side, but that's not skewing the overall New York City housing market.
Certainly the argument you're presenting is pervasive, and I've heard many times. If you look at areas of the city where in recent years there's been the most new housing construction, typically you've also seen the price of housing go up the most. So while I understand the abstract notion of, as Warren was saying, all of the things being equal, if it was in a vacuum, if we leveled New York City and built it from scratch with twice as many apartments or 3 times as many apartments, the average price might be lower. But in the sort of reality of the city we face today and the constraints that are upon it, typically what happens is when you start to significantly increase the amount of new development in neighborhoods, the prices go up, not down, for a variety of reasons. First of all, the housing that's created is mostly market rate. It's typically at the top end of the market. Even under what the city is proposing now, which is to say, we're gonna massively increase the amount of market rate housing that can be built, and in exchange, about 30% of it will be reserved for low-income units. You are still skewing the socioeconomic spectrum far to the upper end. And ultimately, the result, I believe, will be a much less expensive city. It's basically applying writ large what was done in the prior decade in West Chelsea and Hudson Yards, where they did a large-scale upzoning. They produced a significant amount of affordable housing, but they produced about 4 times as much market rate housing. The overall effect, not just in the new construction, but in the surrounding neighborhood, was a much, much, much less affordable neighborhood. Same thing in Williamsburg, Greenpoint.
Let me just contrast the market we're all used to, where for most of us, if you see a new building, you have this instinctive reaction, well, there goes another development I'll never see the inside of. Let me contrast that to a previous building boom, the greatest building boom in the city's history, the 1920s, when something like 650,000 units of housing were built, and it was housing that most New Yorkers could afford, at least some segment of that new construction. Imagine how different we would relate to the market if, instead of the new developments taking away space that we were used to occupying, it was adding to it, as happened in the 20s.
I want to pick up on what Andrew was talking about, how counterintuitive New York is. You know, you add more apartments, and theoretically, you know, you would think, well, that should bring the price down, but the opposite happens. And one of the reasons for that, of course, as Warren said, is that people from all over the globe park their money here, and they use real estate as a investment. So picking up on both of those strings, I was just reading today about the de Blasio administration's plan to upzone East New York. It's been kicked around for a couple of years, and the city council just passed it a couple of weeks ago with only one dissent. And the idea is to put a whole lot of money into this neighborhood, build housing, affordable housing. That's the one of de Blasio's supposed goals, and to increase the density of the neighborhood. And on the surface, that would seem to be a good thing, right? Because East New York it's not gentrified yet. Well, lo and behold, there's a whole lot of people in the neighborhood who don't want that. They're really against the city coming in and upzoning them. Not just because they're going to have tall buildings, which will change the scale of the neighborhood, but the fear of gentrification, which is exactly what you're describing. As soon as a neighborhood is improved, prices go up, and what happens to the community who has been there forever, struggling? These are existential questions that haunt New York forever.
I saw some other hands. You had one here. You were somebody?
I had a very trivial question compared to these issues. You're mentioning the community boards. I was wondering whether they were created as with a clear antecedent back to Jane Jacobs' influence.
Yeah, I think the connection between the community boards and the movement that Jane Jacobs spearheaded is very clear. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, they were originally instituted in Manhattan in the 1960s on a more sort of informal basis. It wasn't yet sort of integral to the land use review structure, in part because elected officials in Manhattan saw how important the organizing in these communities were and the need to give them a voice. So in some ways it was sort of almost a political necessity. That became a model that was then used throughout the rest of the city and has since been institutionalized. Do we have any?
If I may expand on that for just a moment, we've been talking tonight about largely about what you might call Jacobs' urban design critique. Community boards go to her procedural critique of the way cities operate. And the heart of that critique was that cities had to be used by the city. The citizens had to be involved in the government. For that to happen, the government had to be user-friendly. And so, to that end, in 1975, the revision of the charter incorporated 3 critical changes that allowed the Jacobs Revolution to take place on a procedural level. One was community boards, which allowed neighborhoods to speak with one voice. A second was coterminality, which required that administrative agencies use the boundaries of community boards as their basic operating units, rather than, as they had before, whacked up the city's geography in whatever way worked best for them. And the third was the Uniform Land Use Review Process, or ULUR. And you can see how these three work together to allow citizens to have an institutional voice in the growth and development of the city. So,
Do we
yes,
have any,
direct line of development.
do we have any community board members here? We have one. What community board are you in?
I was just appointed.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. Anyone you can try to get involved. Not anyone will get appointed, but anyone has the opportunity to put themselves forward through that process. So we have someone here to talk about. We look forward to working with you too on community board too. There was a question.
We have time for one more question.
We have time for one or two more questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd love to follow up on Warren's rather entertaining and provocative talk. If I understood you correctly, you were expressing concern that Jane Jacobs' criticisms of modernist developments led to a dismissal of the entire modernist movement. And I was kind of curious if you could elaborate a bit more on that, because it seems what she was objecting to wasn't just the excesses of modernism. The issues that she was objecting to would seem to be completely inherent in modernism. If you look at Corbusier's plans for Paris in the 1920s, they're far worse than anything that Robert Moses could have come up with in his worst nightmares. So, I mean, could you present an example of successful large-scale modernist developments that you feel was threatened, or what exactly was lost?
Rather than attempt a case-by-case, obituary for the glories of modernism, which I'm not sure I could mount, and certainly can't mount as I sit here now, because I agree with you with the critique of modernist urbanism. Let me talk instead on a wider sort of cultural level and take you back in time to the age when modernism was the common cultural coin in this country, when there was widespread agreement that the future of the country lay in central planned, centrally administered, hygienic, benignly devised society where everybody would get a good education, where everybody would get a good job that would have reasonable pay, vacation, pensions, and safeguards were built in so that the middle class would survive and thrive. And all of this was tied to the lofty ideas of exploring outer space. I mean, this is why when I was a kid, I was a sci-fi and Star Trek fan. And all of that collapsed in the early 1970s. I don't play all of that at Jane Jacobs' feet by any means, but she was a part of that watershed moment. And that's why, as an adult, I'm an historian. And you can find many, many books on the question of America and the future versus America as a collecting and nostalgic society. There's one book in particular that does this on the music scene. It's called Rock and Roll Can Change Your Life. And it's a very erudite study of how rock and roll has changed and how the consumption of rock and roll has changed from a music of rebellion to a form of connoisseurship. And I don't know how well I'm answering your question, but just by all means.
I think your question was, I think you were looking for an example of how Jane Jacobs, stopped modernism in its tracks. My misunderstanding.
No, my question was, I think Warren seems to be equating modernism with optimism about the future, and I think that's a very, very broad, I'm not sure I accept that.
Okay,
There
well,
were, there were some very specific problems with modernism, and I guess maybe the comment I would make would be, to the extent that there's been a failure of optimism in the future, is the fault with Jane Jacobs for pointing out the problems with modernism, or is the fault with modernism itself, which because of its terribly flawed ideas about what utopia would look like, led to a collapse in optimism about the future? Was it inherent in the modernist project? And is there anything salvageable in that project? I guess that would be what I was getting at.
Well, for what it's worth, I would say I think there's a lot of different ways you can define modernism, or a lot of different things that you could ascribe that title to. Clearly, Jane Jacobs was suspicious of authority, was suspicious of big plans, was suspicious of kind of wiping the slate clean when there was something there which had goodness in it, and that her preference was for allowing it to continue to develop organically. I think those are good principles. I think that they can be applied in many different ways that are positive. I think any philosophy that you have, there can be ways in which it can be applied or used by people where, you know, it could perhaps have a negative effect. I think that there are sometimes big plans that come from central authorities that can actually be good, but I can think of many more examples of ones that are bad and that were worth stopping, and that she, I think, really helped crystallize a movement that did that quite successfully.
And then I think a final remark.
Jane Jacobs was an exceedingly pragmatic thinker and doer, and she rejected all attempts to categorize her either politically or philosophically, and if she could hear this conversation, I think she would stand on her head. You know, modernism, schmodernism, you know, forget it, you know, just walk around, use your eyes, look around, and, you know, try and make it better. That was basically her message.
And I think out of the tower in the park that, I don't know if we defeated it entirely because we seem to have lost the park and we're just getting the tower. But I want to thank our panelists for tonight.